And welcome to Charging Stack. Today we are joined by Martin Lefrancq, a new mobility policy advisor at Brussels Mobility. He leads work on shared mobility, micromobility rules, MaaS, autonomous vehicle pilots, and bringing new vehicles types into the city's transport system. Martin has played a key role in Brussels' shift from free-floating micromobility chaos to a regulated multimodal setup built on a structured tenders, strong data requirements, redesign street space and mobility hubs. He's also active in European mobility governance through networks like POLIS and OECD, ITF. And Martin, thanks for being here. This was quite an introduction.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, Philippe Marin. I'm glad to share this discussion with you.
Likewise. How'd you got here, pretty much? Your background, motivation, early perspectives. What brought you into the world of mobility space?
I was trained as an industrial engineer back in 2005 already, and I wasn't involved very much in transport or nothing like that, but I've always been fascinated by cities and curious about technologies and new trends. So I like to think that this job that I have since 2018, this specific job on new mobility services, etc., is the result of this kind of both trends. I love cities. I particularly love Brussels since I've been born and raised here, and I'm just happy to get involved in these new stuff, basically services and vehicles that pop up in our streets.
Awesome. So we do share similar passions and goals, me and Philip, with you. Just us from Croatia. But was there a specific moment, let's say early on in your career, when you kind of realized cities needed to rethink mobility at a core, at a system level?
Yes, absolutely. First of all, I was involved, I started working for Brussels Mobility a while back, in 2007 to be precise, but in a completely different job. I was more focused about public space. I was involved in lighting design, street lighting design, and architectural lighting design and stuff like that. And I was fascinated by how light could be like an added value for public space design, and how it should be indeed rebalance between the space that we dedicate to regular cars rather than other activities and other modes of transport. So that was the first kind of defining moment for me. I was first focused on public space, and I had this kind of professional, deformation where you visit a city, instead of taking pictures of buildings, you take, pictures of light posts or whatever, like curbsides, etc., like bizarre stuff that you do when you're interested in this kind of stuff. But then overall, when I was working with other people in this area, I kind of got more interested in a more strategic and planning perspective for transport, and that's how I got on to work on these topics in the past recent years.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It happened to me as well. Every time I travel somewhere, I do have the same thing, as you said, deformation of some kind, where I notice different things. I'm not looking at the sights. I'm more focused on vehicles on the road and etc. Is there anything that makes your town, your city, Brussels, uniquely challenging, interesting? What is something you would say stands out, in the space of your what you're researching, what you're focusing on? Is there something specific about Brussels as an environment to work in?
Well, yeah, okay. I don't know if it's really specific, because we like to like. I love my city, but the city you love and you live in, you're always the most critical of. And I know every city have their challenges. I like to think that our city is more challenging than others, but I'm not sure, to be honest, if that's the case. But we have some challenges that are related to the way we are governed, especially in transport. There's different level of governance that are at the regional level. So basically, the whole city of Brussels is also the Brussels capital region, which I represent via Brussels Mobility. But there's also a strong level of competence and governance at the municipality level in terms of transport. They have the right, of course, to decide many transport topic at their own level, whether that's transport or public space management, parking management, I was going to say, stuff like that. So it's true that if you want to have a vision for the whole city, like you live the whole region as one city, of course. But if you
Hmm.
want to have one vision for the whole territory, you have to convince the 19 municipalities that we have. And that's a big challenge, because you most of the time have very different visions at that municipality level. So I would say that's quite a big challenge. And something that is maybe less unique to Brussels, I think many European cities have had this kind of transition in the years 60s or 70s. There's been a lot of transformation in the city to make room for cars. And actually in Brussels, it was also the end of the 50s when we had the Universal Exhibition 1958. And that at that time, like the planners said, we want to show a very modern city, and we're gonna, build highways through the city. And there was a lot of infrastructure for cars that were built at that time, where money was maybe less of an issue than today. And now we have to live with those aging infrastructure, and it's hard to, shift towards some other forms of transport.
Absolutely. And also just, for our listeners outside of you who are potentially not familiar, Brussels as a really important city in the EU as a structure, as a whole politically. So yes, so I wanted to Philip, would you like to move on with the you're muted. You're muted, Philip.
Sorry. Yeah, I wanted to ask a bit about how Brussels evolved to where it is now. So basically, when micromobility exploded some years ago, Brussels, same as practically any bigger European city, was so filled with scooters. It was like thousands of them, and of course, the demand wasn't there at the time. And now Brussels looks quite different. So, what were some key turning points that moved Brussels from this sort of free floating chaos to a structured shared mobility system where everything is kind of regulated at a high level?
Well, of course, it depends on what you consider when you're talking about micromobility. Yeah, I understand your questions that is more specifically targeted towards shared micromobility, but just one information of context. So we've been a strategy for turning Brussels in a more cycling city since basically 20 years ago, when a colleague of mine, the bike manager of the Brussels capital region, was hired. His position was new at the time. So it's been 20 years that he's been working on that. And you clearly see the steps since 2005 roughly, and the evolution of, cyclability of Brussels. But the boom happened indeed later. You have these kind of new providers that happened that arrived in Brussels in 2017. Muscular bike or analog bikes from China, bike, if I remember correctly, and that was quite a surprise for us. For most of the cities, like they popped up
Yeah,
overnight, and we didn't know what to do. But at the time, Minister Pascal Smets of the Brussels capital region had the idea. It ignited the idea. Okay, we don't know what will come next. We need to regulate that. So very early on, compared to other cities, and that's quite remarkable from his perspective at the time. He prepared a regulatory framework. Basically, you had to have a license to be able to provide such a service at the time. In the meantime, those Chinese providers were gone, but we had more local, smaller providers that were there, and that were trying to make a business out of this. But then in 2019, you had the more recognizable brands that we know today, and it grew quite rapidly up until 2020 in the COVID crisis. Then we had a few months of uncertainty, and then once again they all came to Brussels, like all the investors, the fresh money that was invested in these shared micromobility providers. We had almost all of them. At some point, I think it was in 2022, we had 9 providers for shared scooters at the same time, with close to 25,000 scooters. So that was a lot. That was clearly too much. There was not enough demand and not enough space to manage all of these vehicles. So we went again in a second round of regulation. We updated the regulation. It took quite a while because a lot of people were interested and had their word in how we should approach this. And then we ended up in 2023 with a competition call for basically all providers applied for a license. And we delivered 2 licenses for shared scooters, 3 for shared bikes. And then afterward, we had some legal challenges, et cetera, et cetera. We won some of those. We lost some others. But currently, this is the framework, the landscape that we designed in 2023. That's 2 providers for 4,000 scooters each, and 3 licenses for 2,500 bikes each. And the boom, like the demand is there. It's very interesting to see that demand is growing. specifically in some situation of stress for the urban transport system. We've had many strikes, national strikes in Brussels, and the public transport is not there. And you see how shared mobility can absorb some of that demand due to the stress on the transport system.
It's interesting when you say there were around 25,000 scooters. In Brussels has a population of 200,000 people. If we, yeah,
It's more than that. We're 1.2 million people in Brussels.
I mean, in the city center.
The city center, the city of Brussels. Oh yeah, there's a difference.
I mean, city of Brussels itself.
Yeah, but it's weird. We call city of Brussels. It's one of the 19 municipalities, which is the biggest and it's central. But the city of Brussels is one municipality. We live the city
Something like
and
London.
in
Yeah,
1.2 million.
yes, something like London and city of London.
Yeah,
I mean,
sort of something like that. Yeah.
something
It's
like
a
that.
borough of Brussels, basically.
Yeah, I mean, that's a lot to offer. That's a lot of thousands of shared vehicles. My question will be, what part was hardest to change in the last 5 years since everything started to be very regulated? Was it the operator behavior, the rider behavior, or was it some political expectations, maybe some political pushes or something like that?
Well, I'm gonna say like two part of the answer for this. One is the fact that I like to present my work, like working in these new mobility services and new mobility vehicles kind of space. It has a lot to do with change management inside my organization. Like people are mostly focused on their day-to-day job, which is absolutely normal and makes sense. But when there's something new coming up and popping up in the streets, you have to convince a lot of people of the potential added value of these services of your vehicles. And that's one of the biggest challenges. There's a lot of stakeholders in Brussels, and it's a part of the job that I like, but it is quite challenging and quite heavy. It's to speak to people, to convince that it's possible to do something different. And that's quite a challenge because you have the 19 municipalities, you have the region, you have the deciders inside my organization, you have the deciders at the political level. It's a lot of people to speak to talk to, and to try to convince. The other part of the challenge, I think, is that I'm really convinced that in the urban transport innovation sector, you always talk about public-private partnerships. Really believe it's a part of the solution. I'm working hard to make it happen, but I see still a lot of hurdles and challenges to actually find the right balance and the right system in terms of working together, because there's a lot of competition between the providers inside, like within the private sector as well. And trying to make both sides talk the same language is really, really hard. I try to play a role in between, kind of, but it's not easy every day, I have to say.
Yeah, you're kind of playing the glue part in this whole process between all the stakeholders, if I gather that correctly.
Yeah. And it's very fascinating. I mean, I learn a lot about these kind of entrepreneurs and these new ideas. And they have basically different stakes, but it's interesting to see how much like these two sides don't understand each other. They don't understand the added value of the other. And I believe we have a really important role as as a local authority, but sometimes we have to open up a little bit more on what's at stake for these private providers. I find both sides very interesting.
Yeah, and when you mentioned 2000 Brussels being one of the pioneers, let's say, of, you could say, micromobility, e-scooters, etc., we can say that Brussels set the very early standard for other cities. Was there like a regulation that had the most real impact? Regulation change, something that made the adoption faster?
I would say that it came up later. I'm going to mention one specific date and action that was very, very symbolic of the change in Brussels. And that happened around 2012. It was called Picnic the Streets. I think other cities had this kind of same civic movement as well. But basically, citizens of the city sat in the middle of the street in the city center in front of a iconic building, which is called Bourse, really close to Grand Place, which used to be a big car, boulevard, a lot of cars going down there, and people were fed up with that. So they sat in the middle of the street, just as a protest to the policy of how transport evolved in the city center. That was in 2012, and at the time, that was the first step that started local deciders and policymakers to say, okay, maybe we should change something. And it took a long time. It took several years to change the city center, but now it's one of the largest, if not the largest, pedestrian zone in Europe. It's a completely different space. You live it completely differently. So that's very interesting to see that evolution. So that was really a critical moment at the time. It came more from the citizens, like a civic movement, rather than regulatory or policy kind of making. As a policy, significant and iconic, important policy, I would say that the sustainable urban mobility plan that we developed since 2019 all the way to 2021, which is called Good Move. That was a very important strategy as well. That was approved by a regulatory act by the local government. So it's kind of an answer to your question, but basically it was a strategy and a vision for the city, for transport in Brussels for the year 2030, and a set of 50 concrete actions to make that vision a reality. And we're still in that process. We're carrying out all the 50 actions of the Good Move Sustainable Urban Mobility Plan. That was really a critical moment as well.
Well, congrats on your advancements. Definitely you have come a long way. When we talk again, I mentioned e-scooters regarding the process, and we can call them shared mobility, right? That's like a term we can use for them. Is there something you would like to redesign when it comes to a shared mobility state tender today? Is there something you would redefine first?
I think I would focus on the way, like the regulations, the technical kind of tools that providers would integrate to make sure that the vehicles are parked correctly, because it remained a challenge. Early in 2024, we changed from an absolutely free-floating kind of a parking approach to drop zone, or the dedicated parking zone kind of mandate for all vehicles. Things were much better, but there's still a lot of issues to handle from an operational perspective. There's still a lot of vehicles that are overflowing from these drop zones or parked in the middle of a sidewalk, etc., etc. It's much better than before, but I'm sure we can do much better from the providers as well, because the idea is to leave possibility and the freedom for citizens to use these shared micromobility vehicles, which is very interesting and handy and allows for a lot of combination of trips and modes of transport. So that's important for our strategy. But still, there's still too many vehicles in the middle of the sidewalks. There are, a huge problem for a lot of citizens. And we represent, as a city authority, we represent everyone. And we have to make sure that shared micromobility doesn't impact too much other public space users.
Yes, and it's definitely a potential hazard as well. Just recently, the other day, I've seen a scooter, a Bolt here in Croatia, just laying on pretty much on the street, on the asphalt. So, definitely if two cars were going opposite directions, someone would have to stop. And, so yeah, definitely, I agree. It's definitely something that needs to be addressed. And I guess it is hard to kind of define how it is to be solved, an issue that's not an easy fix. But yeah, so my next question would be, what do you see as the next major regulatory question when it comes to European cities? What they must face regarding the micromobility, regarding the shared mobility, whatever we talked about currently?
Well, when it comes to sustainable transport policies at large, I think we're at a critical moment, a sort of a challenging moment as well, because you see a lot of, we call it backlash kind of policies. Have you heard of that word, backlash? It's kind of a backlash of pro-bike or pro-micromobility policies. I think it's kind of a pendulum movement. You go one step ahead, two step back, and then one step forward, or two step forward and one step back, rather. And we're in one of those step back kind of moments. I see that popping up all around Europe. I think we have to work in that direction and sustainable urban transport, of course. But we have to, take into account these kind of counter positions and political movement that say, okay, maybe we've been a little bit too far in shared micromobility or in pro bike policies, which I don't believe. But we have to, assess and reassess the current situation and try to find the best way to push forward progressive policies in terms of transport. That's big challenge. Actually, next week I think Europe will present the new strategy for the car industry, automotive industry, where they might step back in the goals that they've set for electrification. It's one of those critical moments, and I hope they will still be very ambitious because we need it, the industry needs it, and I think it will be a defining moment for basically all sustainable transport policies at every level, whether that's at European level, national level, or here at the regional level.
Yeah, I think we can actually discuss that. I think that's really interesting point you raised regarding the electrification and what it's next for European manufacturing OEMs, because it is something that's definitely affected. I mean, Germany the most, and I mean, of course, and French. The whole Stellantis business is down, and we are being replaced by Chinese manufacturers with, we can say, better technology with better cost effectiveness. But the question is, where do we go from here in regarding to preserve our industries, but also do something that's good for the roads, for the environment, and overall for the humanity. So I don't know. The question is tough. I think all the OEMs realized it's kind of hard to totally shut off the engines, but I don't know. Philip, what you think? It's definitely something that's going to be controversial.
Yeah, I have some controversial opinions about this. I don't know if I'm a fan of Europe-wide electrification. I love cars with internal combustion engines. I mean, it's something you just can't turn off, and I'm quite sad that China is taking over the European companies, the European OEMs in terms of sales and so on. But we can talk about it, of course, but it will be another episode because I'm too controversial for this one.
Well, but you have an interesting point, and I'm not against mechanical or ICE cars per
Yeah.
se. I mean,
Absolutely.
I have an interest for mechanical watches, for example, which doesn't make any sense, but it's more a sort of a hobby or a collection kind of thing. And I believe ICE cars still have a long life for that type of activities. But when it comes to living in a city, like there's more and more of these super loud cars here, like super loud engines. And I'm wondering, like, do I have to suffer from this loud noises if I'm not interested? I really like. I feel, it's quite aggressive when you see such a car going passing the street like that. So yeah, and when it comes to urban transport policies, I still believe that electrification is the way to go. And we've had actually strategy for that in Brussels as well, with the low emission zone and charging infrastructure rollout. We've been catching up. We were quite late in 2018, 2019, but now we're catching up with an offer of charging infrastructure that is sufficient for the demand in terms of electric cars.
I do agree. I am a fan of electrification. I mean, I'm just a fan of the technology overall. I think it's definitely a better technology. There's no doubt about that.
I mean,
It's a better technology.
I can chime in about this. I can say electric vehicles are so efficient. I mean, I was just speaking with Martin about this issue I have. I tend to drive, I don't know, at least 150 kilometers per day, usually. And on a monthly basis, that translates, at least in Croatia, to maybe 250 euros of gas. And when you multiply that by 12, you get 3,000 euros per year just on gas. My car had the initial price of 5,000 euros. And here I am thinking EVs are so bad. I mean, EVs are not bad. They're so cool. They're so efficient. I mean, it so pays off. I mean, every taxi, every Uber, every Bolt, they are all electric, and it makes sense. They don't have to service their vehicle every 12 months. They can service it every 60 months. So, I mean, there are so many pros and cons. Noise pollution. I mean, the noise pollution probably is the biggest one. I mean, EVs, you can't hear unless they program them to be heard. So it's something, I do have some standout opinions on this, but I mean,
No,
electrification
it's fine.
definitely is the way to go. It is the way to go. It is cost effective. But, I also like to take the opposite stance and say, okay, but the earth has unlimited gas. I mean, the gas itself is being constantly produced in Earth's core. It's not like we have a fixed reserve of gas that we're going to eventually, end up spending. It's just not like that. The Earth produces it. So again, it's energy we have that's renewable, definitely. It's not branded renewable. But as I said, we can leave this part for later. I'd actually like to raise a topic of public spaces and the parking problems and the placement mismatches. I think that's personally for me one of the biggest pet peeves I have with basically any city, any European city, because the streets are dense, they are tight, and people's cars are everywhere. And when shared mobility operators come with their scooters, with their e-bikes, with whatever three-wheeler they can conjure, we don't have any space to walk because they're all lying on the floor. It's not regulated. They don't have any racks that are standardized where people can leave their e-bikes, e-scooters to charge. The free floating is cool, but I think it's not very well developed in a lot of European countries. Many next-gen vehicles, to return to the topic, many next-gen vehicles fall between categories, like maybe L6 category, L7 category, which we are big fans of. How should cities rethink space allocation when it comes to all these different categories? Is there a way we can do this efficiently?
If there's one, I don't know it yet. I don't have the answer, but we do ask ourselves the questions, and we try to walk through this challenge. I can talk about a couple of things, some of our experience here, like when we changed the parking policies for shared micromobility. It used to be 100% free floating, and we changed in early 2024 in a dedicated parking zone that we call drop zones. We had to create that infrastructure basically all along year 2023, with the fact that we have 19 municipalities and one region covering, trying to homogenize the policies and the approach. We had to find a way to work forward. We didn't have the money to invest and to create all dedicated drop zones on the whole territory. So we created guidelines with the design agency in partnership with the 19 municipalities and the shared micromobility providers to try to define like a framework and a design of these drop zones that was cheap, efficient, user-friendly, etc. And then we went to see the 19 municipalities and the policymakers and the deciders to roll out these drop zones. And we went from 0 to 2,200 basically in a little more than a year. So that's the fastest that any kind of urban space equipment was rolled out in the city. It always takes a lot of time because it's expensive. You have a lot of regulation and permits to have, and we try to make it as simple as possible so we can make it as fast as possible and at scale, like basically in 12 months. That was a very interesting initiative and project because we changed a lot. I mean, it was a significant change, and we moved almost all stakeholders in the same direction. So it proved that it is possible to change parking policy and rebalance kind of public space that is dedicated parking in a way. We tried to take as much as possible the space from regular car parking zones. I'd say we're around 50 to 60% of these drop zones that were taken away from car parking, which is significant. We can always, aim for better, but given the circumstance, it was quite the challenge. So I think that was an interesting milestone and interesting project that we could get inspired by for the next evolutions. And regarding, like you said, microcars and all these L6E kind of cycles that we see more and more in the streets, we like the idea. We think they have their place in the city in terms of energy efficiency and public space efficiency as well. So we focused that on that topic in the past few months. We had an intern who's been working for several months on that topic, interviewed a lot of people involved on that. And we published a policy paper, a white paper on the future of these type of vehicles and whether we should dedicate parking spaces to that. We believe so. Between a policy and intention and actual result on the street, there's a lot of challenge. So we don't know when exactly we'll be having this kind of infrastructure as well. It's challenging and it's exciting to see how things will evolve on that front.
That's you're creating new spatial category, something that's not bike parking and it's not car parking, something like a drop zone, but something that an L6E category vehicle could use. I mean, we just maybe 1 hour ago, we just covered an L6E category vehicle scooter. They're based in Milan, and they are the thin mobility vehicle. They're like less than 1 meter wide and maybe too wide for a bike parking, too thin for a car parking, not maybe for a drop zone where we can leave e-scooters, but there maybe could be some kind of spatial category for those vehicles that are like super thin, less than 1 meter wide.
Yeah, it changes everything when it comes to public space design. Like if you have to design and create parking spaces for all these new types of vehicles, it becomes quite complicated. Public space management, and also in terms of in enforcement, like people on street that they really have to control, enforce things and regulations. They're starting to say like there's so many different uses and dedicated parking zones for logistics, for shared micromobility, for car sharing, etc., etc. It's this kind of overcomplication is hard for some people to understand, and then sometimes they want to say, let's get things more simple, please, because otherwise it's going to be a mess to operate. But yeah, it's very interesting to take into account every challenge and every things that's at stake from all stakeholders' perspective, and try to find a solution that combines all of this. We're not there yet for these kind of microcars. It's just the beginning of the work.
And now I think we are, I think infrastructure cannot follow how many categories we are creating, especially
completely.
in the old European cities. We're advancing so fast. Infrastructure cannot. There's not enough space to be. I think that's the biggest problem. The space.
Yeah, and if I might quickly add also, so it's true, very true for public space and infrastructure. Like the cycle to change things is very long from a city's perspective, but also from a regulation perspective. Like an administration and then like the governance of a local authority was designed to be stable, as much stable as possible. So if you want to change regulations to adapt to a new vehicle, new service, it usually takes at least a year, more likely 2 or 3 years to make something happen. And when you reach the end of the process, sometimes it's not relevant anymore because the service has changed already. So it's really hard to try to find the right momentum between policymaking and actual innovation in transfer.
Yes, we had Brussels representative Annick Ruting from Liva EU, and we were discussing many hurdles of especially e-scooters where we don't know where to actually put them. Where should they drive? It's not clear. They're definitely not for the pedestrian part and then they're not for the bike lane as well, because they're technically not bikes, especially with all these foreign versions that can go up to, I don't know how fast, 90 kilometers per hour, but they're also not for the road. So where do we put them? So this is just one of the examples how it is a problem for regulation, because it is hard to regulate. Maybe from the outside, it's going to be like, oh yeah, Europe, of course, we're overcomplicating things, but it is hard. We are not the only ones. Everybody has the problem with regulating them. We had a guest on the show from Australia who is creating its own e-scooters charging docks. And he was telling us, yeah, you guys are amazing when it comes to us. We are many steps behind. So we do have to be grateful at some level.
Yeah, I think Europe is quite forward on this because, I mean, I always like to take history into consideration. I mean, the cities we live in have been here for thousands of years. city centers have been there for thousands of years, mainly unchanged. And that's the beauty of it. And we don't want to change these streets. We just, want to alter them a little bit so that our development can keep up with it and we can keep up with the development of all the new mobility systems. I think that's probably the most unique challenge Europe has. I mean, okay, America was built for cars. You go to Dallas, Texas, you can see everything's 19 degrees angle. Everything's straight, wide, big. But in Europe, it's you know our primary transportation was by a horse not so long ago, and here we are with L6E category vehicles in 2025. It's quite a challenge to regulate this.
Yeah,
And
Absolutely.
this
can only
leads
agree.
us to a topic you previously mentioned you'd be a bit critical of the mobility hubs, where the multi-modality was turned into a real system. You co-authored the Brussels Mobility Hub strategy. Could you tell us what kind of problems were you aiming to solve with this? How did this all turn out? How did it look like in the beginning?
Well, first of all, as I said earlier, we have the framework, that the policy framework that we have for transport strategy is called Good Move SUMP, Sustainable Urban Mobility Plan, called Good Move. In these, you have 50 concrete actions. Shared micromobility is one, mobility as a service is second, etc., etc. One of the 50 is creating these mobility hubs, this new kind of infrastructure, multimodal, intermodal infrastructure, to make lives easier, basically, for citizens to find the transport service, and and to make it visible, make it more accessible in the public space. So we had the opportunity a few years ago in the Resilience and Recovery Facility program of the European Commission, basically the post-COVID recovery program and funding program that they had. We got a project on MaaS, mobility as a service, but we tried to have different aspects of it, the digital as well, the digital part, which is of course necessary for MaaS, but also we wanted to have a physical MaaS, which is like the premise of a mobility hub is. So we had this funding, we worked on a strategy, like really a study on how it should look like, where it should be located, what it should be used for, which kind of users, etc., etc. That was very interesting process, and we really saw on the map where this kind of infrastructure should go. Then we went one step further and we started to work on the design, like the actual look of these mobility hubs, how we should integrate them in the public space. And then the latest step, which was the hardest, is actually to go, to make it happen, to build them, to put it in the public space. And the further, like the more I work in this area, the further I realize how hard it actually is to put something new in public space. You have a lot of people to convince, you have a lot of permits to ask, you have a lot of complication, and you have to think about maintenance, which is a big challenge. And the nice idea that we had on mobility hubs, we realized that it was so hard to actually install that we will never reach the scale that we need and the network that we need to be actually relevant and to make it actually work. You have to reach a scale, you have to reach a certain density to hope that people will actually use it at a certain scale. And this is not happening, unfortunately. So we're currently in a sort of a reevaluation process. What can we do with the kind of mobility hub approach and philosophy that doesn't require actually installing stuff in the public space? Can we make it a little bit different, or make it as light as possible? The intervention on street should be as light as possible so that we can scale as fast as we'd like to. But that's the current phase we're in. We had a nice idea, a nice process, but unfortunately, it's, we were, we have to reevaluate this kind of approach.
Understood. Yeah, it's a big challenge to overcome. I mean, a lot of people to convince. You said it yourself. So, I mean, if I would ask you if you could change one thing that could make this work much better, what would it be?
That's a really tough question. I think, like in every kind of discussion that I have on these new mobility policies or initiatives or projects, there's one stuff that's being taken for granted and that we don't question, we don't challenge, is indeed, it's kind of obvious to say, but it's indeed the space, the public space that is dedicated to regular cars. Even in the shared mobility space, I realized that shared cars are considered more normal than shared scooters, for example. When you speak to the average person, it makes sense to have shared cars, and there's not too many restrictions and regulations compared to shared scooter, for example. So this sort of considering the car that is normal and that we shouldn't disturb too much. So if we can, change one thing and then make people realize that it's quite an unfair situation, that would be really, really helpful, because most people don't realize that and don't see that, how unfair this current situation is. And, in this transport innovation, we'll also talk a lot about, sorry, I can't find my words, a level playing field between the stakeholders and the private players. But it doesn't exist right now. Like, we always consider the car as normal, and that's a tough issue to solve.
Yeah, that's kind of the paradigm we need to maybe shift over time. But I get what you're coming from. It's always easier to accept a new car on the road than a new vehicle category on public space.
Absolutely.
We
Yeah, I wanted to talk mobility changers.
Yeah.
And yeah, definitely was something you were greatly involved in. What surprised you the most about how quickly families adopted once they received, coaching budgets, alternative vehicles, and what do you think this model as it is succeeded, where, for example, MaaS apps struggled?
Well, first of all, that's also an initiative that was carried out in the framework of this resilience and recovery facility from the European Commission. The same MaaS project that we had, and with which we worked on mobility apps. We also had this kind of awareness raising, marketing campaign on the multimodal lifestyle aspect of the project, and that's what Mobility Changers was. There was this idea of trying to help people and real life families to make that change and to change their behavior. For that, so basically we asked them to accept the challenge, give us their car keys, and in return we gave them an e-bike, a cargo bike, and mobility budget of around 500 euro to use public transport or shared mobility services. But there was this kind of initial coaching that we gave them. And there was this kind of 24-hour WhatsApp group where they could ask questions and in case they had like an emergency or a situation, etc. So it took a lot of resources to actually follow them. But this push, this nudge that we gave them really changed massively their behaviors afterwards. We did surveys of these families that took the challenge, and like right after the challenge, they said, we're going to use less the car. We're maybe going to sell one. And actually 6 months later, there are some families that sold their cars and changed their behavior. So that's a massive change, like more than any MaaS app, as you said, can imagine do. But it's true. Afterwards, probably these MaaS applications, we have a public sector MaaS application in Brussels, which is called Floya. They probably used it to make this new lifestyle easier, but that's not the MaaS app didn't change their behavior. It's the actual coaching and nudging that we gave them during the challenge. So that's very, very powerful. And then we use, of course, these stories and kind of funny situations that we shared on social networks to have sort of a ripple effect, and not just these 87 families that we had in the challenge. And so it's a project that I really love because it's innovation without actually being technological or super expensive. So that's something that I really like.
Yeah, props to you, Martin. Really interesting. I don't know if I, indirectly was involved in the challenge, because at the time when this was happening, I also sold my vehicle and I only turned to bicycle.
Okay.
But yes, and I haven't, gone back since. But definitely something that, especially us in the European cities where public transport actually works. We have streets that are walkable, that are mostly safe also for kids and adults. So definitely, yeah, I really love this initiative, and it's definitely something, how to solve let's say, a problem without actually tackling the problem with the technology, but just psychologically changing the changing the, I don't know, I'm also searching for a word, but changing the mindset of the people,
Yeah.
that it's actually possible.
When I first read about that project, when we were preparing for the interview and for the kickoff call, I was like, man, these people really gave this up and they are enjoying it. I mean, it was like, wow. I mean, that's because of they could adapt to a life without a vehicle. That's really not so much required in a city where you have like shared e-scooters, shared cars, public transportation, buses, trams, trains. I mean, in my case too, if I mean, I do drive a lot, but if I didn't do all these activities that require me to do a lot of driving, I mean, I would never buy a car. I would, I mean, maybe I would for long distance driving and so on, but I can rent a car if I need to go on a trip. It really surprised me, the results. I didn't expect the people to be so satisfied, and it seems that you're cracking the code and changing the mindset. And it doesn't take more tech to change it. It takes just a bit of coaching and just a bit of education. And it seems that's kind of right way to go. Moving from this, I want to ask you about the China trip because we're already 50 minutes in, and you told us that was kind of a cool moments you had where you recently visited China to study the autonomous mobility, shuttles, robotaxis, and Xpeng's factory. Regarding all of that, because we know China is currently huge in EVs and AVs, what struck you the most about the maturity of deployments there? What was kind of the wow factor that surprised you when you came there?
Well, the thing that I really didn't expect when I got there, and then I'll explain a little bit more about the context and why we went there. But the thing that struck me the most was the scale of things. Like, first of all, I knew China was huge. I knew cities were huge, but getting there is actually, something else entirely. Like, the cities are so big, and the scale of deployment of AVs was much higher than what I expected. When we talk about robotaxis, there's already some cities that have thousands of robotaxis already deployed. The amount and the number of cities that actually have robotaxis services, there's quite a lot as well. And also in AV logistics, urban logistics, that was the most impressive thing because we didn't know anything about that kind of activities before we got there. And you had these companies that already, close to 10,000 vehicles, autonomous vehicles deployed in streets in more than 200 cities in China, that actually were delivering packages in those cities. So that scale was really, for me, unimaginable. That was something really that struck me a lot. Just as a a context, a word of context, we were there with a European delegation, about 25 people, half of them from Belgium, but the rest from the rest of Europe, in the framework of a EU-funded project again, funded by EIT Urban Mobility. It's twofold, this project. We have the deployment of 2 autonomous shuttles in the city of Leuven, really close to Brussels, as a partnership for public authorities to learn about autonomous mobility. And in its kind of training and awareness raising part for public authorities, there are some trips that are organized. This was one of them. China was one of them. And we were there to realize how advanced the technology is, how scaled it actually is already, and to raise awareness to our policymakers, decision makers, to say we should hurry in terms of getting prepared for these things to arrive. We're not late on industrial aspect of things. It's different, but on a policy making aspect of things, we're not too late, but we have to act now and act fast.
When we think about what China has done with autonomous vehicles, I mean, it's kind of obvious to everyone that it's coming. I mean, it will be in Europe. In every city, we'll have some robot taxis. For example, we have a Croatian company, Rimac. I mean, it's Vern actually, which they are building their own robot taxis, and I think they will deliver. I'm not sure how many prototypes this month. So It's kind of starting to boom. We've covered here on Charging Stack a ton of companies that are already doing this, integrating commerce into autonomous vehicles, and it works so well. My question for these parts would be, what kind of lessons did you bring back to Brussels, both for policy and for realistic expectations?
That's a tough question. What we realized and noticed there in China is that all these local policies for transport is actually trickling down from an industrial vision. Test beds in these areas of the cities in China that are dedicated to a deployment of autonomous vehicle. Actually, the public agencies and public authorities that give a framework for these depend on the Ministry of the Industry and Innovation, etc. Not transport. That was an interesting observation that we made. Not that I would recommend that. I think we have a different framework in Europe, but it makes sense from their perspective, and it's really interesting. They really want to be number one in the world when it comes to innovation, autonomous vehicles, electric vehicles, etc. And they create an environment that is, favorable for this kind of industrial development. That's not the case in Europe yet. I think we get inspired by that kind of approach, even if we have to take into account like the local, what makes Europe Europe. As you said earlier, we have different cities, we have a different transport vision and strategy, so we have to adapt that. But it's important for European competitiveness to be able to know what's happening in China and try to propose something different. We shouldn't try to make exactly the same as what China is producing, trying to have a different proposition that could find its own market as well. What more can I say about that? It was really sort of a life-changing experiment for me, from the colleague Dimitri Straube, who got there as well. It was the first time that I got into robotaxi, and it's really eye-opening. The first 2 minutes are really impressive. There's a wow effect, but then you start talking with the other people in the car, judging. Oh, I like the way it took this turn, etc. Like if it was an actual driver, but you don't get impressed that much afterward. After a few tries, it's actually quite boring. But that's how good the technology is. I think that's a good indicator, actually, of how good it is.
Yeah, kind of. It kind of reminds me. I mean, it's a totally different thing, but like first time flying. I think first time flying in an airplane.
Yeah.
Oh my God, I'm flying, and then afterwards it's just okay. I'm flying. Definitely,
Absolutely.
robotaxis. My goal is to go to China as soon as possible whenever I get a chance, because I would really like to experience everything regarding the state of their mobility industry. Because I think, as you said, we are Europe, we are not China. But I think we can definitely learn a lot and adapt it in our own systems, change it and adapt when it comes to some things. So yeah, I wanted to kind of again go back to Europe, European perspective and kind of transferability. So you've contributed to OSCD and ITF, working on integrating public transport into MaaS. What gaps do you still see in Europe's mobility governance? Which cities do you think Brussels can learn from, maybe outside of Europe or inside of Europe, and which cities can learn from Brussels, vice versa?
Well, that's a very good question as well. I think this project and this collaboration that we had with the International Transport Forum, and specifically the innovation team led by Philippe Christ, which is really a mentor for me. So it was a great experiment, a great experience for me to work with him. That allowed me to learn a lot about transport innovation, mobility as a service, and public transport integration. And I realized that between the policies and the ideas and the intentions that you might have in these projects and the actual integration of public transport, there's still a long way to go, specifically in Brussels, where there's still a lot to do in terms of digitalization of ticketing, of pricing of public transport. And what sets Brussels apart is that we have all 4 public transport operators active in Belgium. They're also active in Brussels. You have 3 regions, the federal for train and the more urban kind of public transport. And we have to find an agreement between all these stakeholders, and it's quite tricky. So we have the same MaaS platform provider as Yelby in Berlin, and we see the difference in terms of numbers and people using the MaaS app between what's happening in Berlin and Brussels. And it's quite Berlin is quite inspiring regarding public transport integration. Most of the transactions happen for public transport, and then you see shared mobility as a support, which is very interesting. In Brussels, as we don't have the digital ticket for public transport, we don't see much transactions happening for public transport. All the space is taken by shared mobility, which is also quite an interesting signal. But we want more. We want public transport. We want the whole shebang in the integrated public in the MaaS application, which is still a long way to go. I realize how these technical transitions and digitalizations is really, really hard to agree on a data format, data standards, etc. There's still a lot of investment and resources working on that to reach that point.
Yes, definitely a lot of things to consider. I'm thinking, in your opinion, anything that something that's not applicable to the other cities that was applied to Brussels, let's say. Is there something completely specific to Brussels that's not transferable to the other? Is there something unique? That's why I wanted to ask.
Something unique. Yes. Well, I'm going to say the fact that we have this kind of sustainable urban mobility plan, the strategy that's been voted and approved by all levels of governance, that's something unique. I don't think there's actually a lot of other cities that have that. And even though if it's been quite challenged, like a lot of people, raise their voice against it, we still have that kind of long-term strategy. It's very important to have that. And I don't think most of the cities have that. So that's something that's specific to Brussels, I would say.
And if we talk future, if we move, let's say fast forward 2030, 2035, we kind of mentioned those years regarding the electrification of Europe. What does a well-functioning Brussels mobility ecosystem look like, in your opinion? We got a met goal, or I mean, we could be realistic. It's 5 years, pretty much, even less.
Yeah. It's not that far, indeed.
But it's not
We're
far.
getting
It's like
closer.
2030, but it's actually not.
No. If you want to make something happen in 2030, you have to act now in terms of policies, and that's for sure. I think the further we'll go in the future, the more we realize like the best innovation and the most important invention in urban transport was the e-bike. E-bikes change people's lives, and we've seen again, not only in shared micromobility, but general e-bike adoption in Brussels. It's been amazing, specifically after COVID. A lot of cargo bikes as well. You see them everywhere. So like in 2030, we'll look back and we'll realize how the addition of a battery and an electric motor on a bike was really a game changer, and what will drive modal shift, the most. We'll also hopefully see, like in 2030, I hope we'll have a balanced approach on how to manage shared mobility services. Like I've realized the more I go forward, the more I realize that shared mobility is MaaS is shared mobility. You have to have these shared services to actually have the freedom to combine a lot of different mode of transportation. If you don't have that, you don't have an actually believable, possible multimodal lifestyle. So hopefully in 5 years, we'll be all hand in hands with the private providers of shared mobility and work together instead of actually working sometimes against each other.
And is there a metric potentially you'll be watching closely, or there is like a metric you would like to say in 5 years? Okay, we saved 15% of the space for thin mobility parking for e-scooters. Is there something you're specifically looking at?
When you talk about MaaS, shared mobility, or urban planning, urban transport planning, basically, if you have to set some things up, it's to use a little bit less of the private car and a lot more of anything else. So that's the most important indicator is the mode share, and we've set our goals for 2030 to drop the mode share of the private car to 24%, and 76% of everything else. And that's the most important indicator. So if you see growth in anything else than the private car, then you're winning, no matter what it is, actually. So yeah, that's the most important indicator. I tend to focus more on shared mobility because
Yeah.
it's one of my biggest um, uh, topic that I focus on. I like to see growth happening there, but anything that's not the car is always a win.
Awesome. We wish you all
And
the luck. And
I must say, when you said that about e-bikes, I really must say I 100% agree that e-bikes are the best mode of transportation we have been introduced to in maybe last 20, 30 years. They are expensive. Yeah, that is the case. But yeah, I mean, look, if you want a good e-bike, you'll pay 2,000 euros, around 2,000 euros, maybe less. But what excites me is I have some old bike, some old MTB, which I rarely drive, but I rarely ride, but there are some conversion kits. I mean, my bike was 300 euros. There is a 400 euro conversion kit, which can make my bike into an e-bike, which can give me 90 kilometers of range, which can get me up to 60 kilometers per hour, which is insane. And it in total, it costs 700 euros to make my regular bike an e-bike. And I'm like, okay, so do I need a car? If I in our city we have really well defined bike lanes. I mean, that's one of the things I really have to say. One of the really well defined bike lanes, and I want to go from one side of the city to the other one. I have a bike lane that connects them directly. And do I need a car to go that 10-kilometer trip, or I can do it in a few minutes with my bike? And it's so weird. It's so cool. And I think that's gonna explode. That's just gonna go so wide in the next 10 years. Just my 2 cents, e-bikes are going to be like number 2 mode of transportation after a car. So let's, since we're well past 1 hour mark, and let's just, we have a ton more questions. Like, we could do 1 hour more of this, but we have to be considerate of other people's times. And so let's move to the closing section, a quick fire round where we will ask really short questions and you give us a quick answer. So
Excellent.
first one would be, what is one mobility trend you are really optimistic about?
Yeah, I'm gonna say e-bike adoption
Yeah.
and use, which makes sense.
Makes sense, absolutely. And one mobility trend you think that is overrated in your opinion?
Overrated? I'm gonna say autonomous mobility. I think there's like everybody's saying it's the future of transport. I do believe it's part of it, but don't bet too much on it. Like, scale is still limited for the moment, so yeah, it's a bit overhyped for the moment, I think.
And if you had the power to change one regulation tomorrow, which one would it be?
These old categorization, which is impossible to understand for anyone, and have a more wider definition of it. Too hard to understand and to make other people understand. It's even harder.
One more, a mobility hub feature every city should adopt.
Well, it's I don't know the English word, like signage, like have
Okay.
a clear way to display the different modes in the public transport, timetables, stuff like that. Make it simple, clear, beautiful, and people will use it more.
Okay, that's an interesting take here.
Design will change the world.
Yeah, I can agree, absolutely. And the final question from this quick round, what's the last mobility data insight that surprised you?
It's how big shared mobility was during the strikes in Brussels. Like, I never thought it would be this big. We reached 100,000 trips in one day for shared mobility modes. You have to compare that to some others, but for Brussels, it's really big. It's 10% of public transport you usually do in a day. So that's massive.
Yeah, that sounds, that number is just huge. I mean, I'm just shocked right now, secondhand. I think we've exhausted everything we've had in plan for this round 1 interview. Huge thanks, Martin. Thank you for joining us. From shared mobility governance to mobility hubs, real world behavior change, electrification, insights from China's mobility ecosystem. We've gone through everything. Martin's work highlights the difference between mobility hype and mobility reality. We'll be watching closely, definitely closely, as Brussels continues to refine one of the Europe's most ambitious multimodal mobility systems. This has been everything for this episode of Charging Stack. Thank you for listening and see you on the next episode.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Martin.
Thank you so much. Thank you.